I always enjoyed my Sunday visits with Grandpa. He wasn't able to take care of himself anymore, so the family had moved him into a retirement community. Being an independent person, Grandpa had made a big fuss about moving in at first. However, once he started to get to know the other residents and learned about all the activities that went at the home, he felt a little better about being there. After Grandpa moved in, I would visit him every Sunday and join him at the weekly game challenge. The game changed depending on the week. Sometimes it was Gin Rummy, other times it was Shuffleboard, and sometimes it was Bingo. The games were chosen ahead of time by the residents from a list of all the available games written on it. When the game was decided upon, the entire hall would be covered in an arena for the game choice. This week, the residents had chose to play backgammon, admittedly not one of my favorites. After we played a few rounds of the weekly game, Grandpa and I would have some lunch at the retirement home dinner hall, and I would head back to his room so he could tell me one of his favorite stories. Grandpa had all kinds of stories about gnomes, fairies, giants, and other supernatural creatures. He even told me about the urban legends like alligators living in the sewers, and he had heard while growing up in New Jersey. It was always fun hearing Grandpa's stories. I always look forward to hearing a new one every week. The years passed and I entered high school. I didn't stop by to visit my grandpa often anymore because I became busy hanging out with my friends and doing homework and starting to date girls for the first time. Even though I didn't have the same amount of free time when I was younger, I would still try to visit my grandpa as often as I could and join in Sunday games. I would have lunch with Grandpa and listen to his tall tales when he was back to his room. I was older, but I still loved listening to his stories. It seemed like he never ran out of subjects to talk about. He even told me about his experience as a pilot in World War II. It always took a great fun listening to the trouble he got into the pilot. Flying under billboards, seeing how long he could make his personal plane after he bought after the war go. Finally, it came time for me to go to college. I would not be back for a while, so I wanted to spend a lot of time with Grandpa before I left. I noticed his health had taken a turn for the worse, but he never brought it up. I never brought it up either, because I didn't want to think about the fact that Grandpa's health was fading. I visited him like usual until the last day I had free before I started the new semester. This would turn out to be a visit that I would never forget. We had our usual schedule, play a game, chat over lunch, and all these new things we brought into our lives, and then go back to his room for a cup of coffee, butterscotch cookies, and one of his tall tales. We sat at the table next to one another, drinking our cookies into the hot coffee, eating them one by one. Today, Grandpa seemed more introverted than usual. He hadn't really said much over lunch either. I figured this was because he was having one of those quote-unquote bad days, or the days when his bones ached and he had a hard time trying to get around. However, I didn't think this anymore when I saw Grandpa stop eating the cookies in front of him and he gave me the most serious look he's ever given me in his life. He put my cookie down as well and listened for whatever it was Grandpa was about to tell me. He cleared his throat and in a gray tone said, "You're older now, Thomas. You're about to go off to university and experience a whole new chapter in your life. That is why today I have to give you some advice." I smiled at him and urged him to go on. Grandpa nodded and continued where he left off. "You are the first person I am telling this story to. I told myself I would only tell my most devoted grandchild the story in hopes that they would not make the same mistakes I did in life. And you must promise me that you will only tell the story to your most devoted grandchild. so that every generation is giving a fair warning. Grandpa paused and made sure I was going to keep the promise. I swore that I would on my life, and then he continued on. So, you remembered your grandmother, don't you? You were only 5 when she passed away. At this he paused when he saw my expression changed a bit. After patting my shoulder for a moment, he went on. Yes, I miss her too. I always loved her dearly. It is at my age that I have had a long time to reflect on my past actions. I wish that when we were married, I could have treated her better. If I had treated her better, maybe she wouldn't have turned out like that. I was taken back a bit by his statement. Well, what do you mean? Grandpa sighed. This is what I want to talk to you about. Some advice I want to offer you I want to offer you as you head off into the world, and I want to make you a better life for yourself. You see, your grandmother and I got married in the 50s, and in those times, men were the king of the house, and their wives had to tend to their every need. I'm not saying it's right. It's just the way things were back then. I was the same as most men of that era. I was fresh out of the military service from World War II. Had just settled down with your grandmother. We bought a cheap house into a government program to encourage home ownership and got a job working in an office. Fortunately, like most men of the era, I was very hard on your grandmother, who, like most women of the era, just stayed home. I always demanded the best from her. The best housework, the best meals, the best hosting whenever we had neighbors over. I insisted that she always dress up, wear makeup, and put on her fine jewelry when managing the house. No wife of mine was going to be a slob and get me mocked by the neighbors. Looking back now, I realize how silly I was to demand that of all of her. But I suppose we were both victims of the culture back then. I think my strictness got to your grandmother. And at times, because there were occasions when I would see her weeping to herself as she made dinner in the kitchen. When she was like that, I would leave her alone. I tried to suggest that she watch one of her shows on the Women Network or listen to a cooking show on the radio, but my suggestions just made her more upset. So I learned to give her space when she was in one of her moods. However, one night, she was so upset that she burned one of our meals. Even after burning it, she still served it both our dishes at the table, sat down to eat her own portion, still weeping as she shoveled the burnt pieces into her mouth. This was unacceptable to me. I chastised her for what she had done and told her to go back in the kitchen and make a new dinner for us both. I told her if she couldn't get to herself together to simply make me a sandwich, that ought to calm her down a bit. It was then that something changed in her. Her tears suddenly stopped, and a small smile crept on her face. She laughed a bit, and I laughed too. The whole situation was a bit comical. I apologized for being strict, and she shook off the whole thing. She brought the dishes back into the kitchen and set forth to making a second meal, which, when served for the second time, was up to the usual quality of her cooking. After that incident, your grandmother didn't cry again. She went happily doing her housework and preparing the meals. When she was chastised, she would smile and say she did better. She was the model housewife. It was around that time, and one of my good friends, Jerry, went missing. Your grandmother knew his wife, Edith, and together they all got the housewives involved in trying to find him. Put up flyers but unfortunately Jerry was not seen again. It was a few months later when another of my friends, Stan, went missing. The housewives got together again to find him with little success. After that, the excitement died down. Although the men were not found, No one else went missing, and then from the neighborhood, it became somewhat of a local mystery. None of the men had a reason to go missing. They both worked at the same office that I did, and they both had stable home lives. Even to this day, the neighborhood is still talking about the circumstances surrounding their disappearance. The incident that did bring the community closer together. The housewives ended up forming their own club, which became the National Sorority. It was open for many years during that time, donating a lot of its time to helping the less fortunate people in the community. I was one of those people who always wondered what happened to Jerry and Stan. They were good friends, and I always said it was always sad to lose them. It was when your grandmother health was failing, and many years later that we got talking about my old time friends. Here my grandfather paused, as if the subject was hard to talk about, but when he saw my concerned expression, he continued on. Don't worry about me, lad. I'll be okay. Now, where was I? Oh, yes. Many years later, your grandmother and I were talking about Jerry and Stan. This is when she brought all of it up. All the great things she had cooked while we were looking for them. The mouth-watering roast she had prepared and fed all of the members of the search party. The roast beef sandwiches she had packed for the lunches I took to the office. The blood pudding she had made for the neighbors. She went on like this, naming all of her different meats she had cured and served to the people over many years. I recalled one of her meals was with warmth, but was a bit confused why she would have brought it up when I was talking about my old friends, and it was when the smile came over her face, that same smile that had come over her face at the dinner table those many years ago, an unsettling kind of grin that seemed to reach in and tug at my very soul. "They have already been cooked, dear," she said in a crackling, uneven tone. I felt myself retch a bit at the thought of consuming that terrible thing that I had. Your grandmother had just chuckled and continued on. "I cooked them along with all the people you complained about at your job. Remember how you complained about Stan and Jerry get promoted before you? I took care of that, didn't I? I made sure the supervisors who were bullying you moved away. Of course, they really didn't go anywhere other than my cooking pot. I always made sure to cook a perfect meal out of all those naysayers just for you." Grandpa stopped his tail to retch a bit. I stared at him with my mouth open. I could feel the color draining from my face. At this point, I was visibly shaking. When he got a hold of himself, he continued on. "Shortly after your grandmother told me that, she passed away peacefully in her sleep. That same creepy smile was painted on her lips when I found her. After her funeral came and went, her last words haunted me. I wanted to know more. I started reading through her old journals and learned that the women's club she had formed, the Jersey White Hat Club, had a very dark practice that they put into place. Should any man give them a hard time, it was not above them to punish him in any possible way. They outlined all the ways that they could punish their significant others, boyfriends, or troublesome men in their lives. Their recipes for poison, instructions how to psychologically torture people, and there were many dark things I read in these journals that I don't even want to repeat them. But one of their most twisted games was talking about a friend when troublesome men in their lives and serving it to him in front of the form of food. They had all sorts of recipes about cooking and preparing human beings. Those journals were some of the most horrible things I ever read in my life. I would have burned them all if I didn't turn them to the police station for evidence. That's what I did. The police read the journals over in complete disbelief. I gave them the journals with specific conditions of keeping my family out of the media and investigations. I told them that it was the only way I would hand over the evidence. Since I knew the head of my local police station, he pulled some strings and focused on as much of the investigation on the living members of the sorority, like your grandmother, best friend Edith. They investigated the local Jersey White Hat Club and all of the current members for questioning. Our family sat on the sidelines watching the whole thing in disbelief. As you know, Edith had been one of our closest family friends for years. Everyone was shocked when she was actually a member of such a dark cult. If they knew everything that I do about your grandmother, they would have been more horrified. Fortunately, that was not a truth that any of them had to bear. Later, the police found that every chapter of sorority across the United States was still practicing the dark rituals and written in your grandmother's journals. They were able to successfully shut down the sorority 2 years ago after being active for all those years. But I heard recently a new club started up under a different name. This is the advice I want to give to you. If you meet a girl wearing a white opal stone shaped like a moon on her left ring finger, under no circumstances you have any relationship with her. Report her and whatever club she's affiliated to with the police. It's a secret calling card, and just to be safe. Here, Grandpa paused to take a drink of glass of orange juice beside his coffee, to calm his nerves, and then he continued on. Never, I repeat never, mock a girl by asking her to make you a sandwich. Don't demand anything from her. Treat her equal. Let her do as she pleases, and if I had learned to be kinder to your grandmother after all those years ago, I wouldn't have created the monster that she became. Be kind to the ladies in your life, grandson. Consequences for doing otherwise are dire. And with this, Grandpa felt quiet. His hands were wrapped around his glass with orange juice for support, but they were visibly shaking. I was shaking too. After all, this was all too much to take in. I could only sit there staring at my grandfather in silence. Every time words came into my mouth, they quickly left me. The two of us didn't talk for the rest of our visit. I simply got up from the table and walked to my car without another word when it was time to leave. The words of my grandfather's story echoed throughout my mind on the long drive home. 4 years after my visit, shortly after I received my bachelor's degree, my grandfather passed away. I attended the funeral in the late spring. The whole family was there. My mother, my father, his 2 brothers, my cousins, my sister, and her husband. Oh, of course, the more obscure family members were there were 2 like my grandfather's sisters, and the cousins 3 or 4 times removed, and other assorted relatives. Your standard fare for the typical family gatherings. It was an open casket funeral, so the family could come up and look at him lying peacefully in his new home. I came up and paid my respects and silently promised my grandfather that I wouldn't tell what I knew to anyone in our family, and thanked him for all the times we shared. It was then that one of my female cousins came up and paid respect to our grandfather too. She tried to lighten the mood by teasing me about finding a girlfriend. I told her I was in no hurry to find one, and she rolled her eyes. As she walked into the other family members, I got the sight of something white on her finger. My heart started beating loudly in my chest at the sight of it. It was an opal stone cut in the shape of a moon. She wore on her left ring finger. My eyes shot around the rest of the room. My aunt wore the ring. My female cousins wore the ring. My grandfather's sisters wore it as well. My mother wore it. My head started spinning as I realized all the family members of the family wore the same ring. I felt my heart pounding louder and louder in my chest. My grandfather made a big mistake not letting her family involved in the investigation. This thought washed over me, and I saw more family members enter the funeral house wearing the infamous ring, and the walls felt more and more like they were closing in on me.